What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react to a video that really caught my attention. This is called Has Norway Become Too Rich? Which is a really interesting question. And it's a bit confusing for me as well. I know that Norway is very wealthy and successful, but is that a bad thing? Here in the United States, they teach us to get as much money as possible. So I'm really curious to learn more about this and if Norway being rich is really a problem. So let's take a look.
For most of 2025, this book, which translates to The Country That Became Too Rich, has topped Norway's non-fiction bestseller lists.
What is this? What is this? This is a popular book in Norway. This is about Norway, the country that became too rich. So this is a big topic of discussion already. I haven't heard anything about this. I got to be honest. I didn't even know anybody was talking about this. But there's an entire book, a best-selling book written about this topic, the country that's become too rich. Are there a lot of people who actually think this?
While there's a pretty widespread consensus that Norway has managed its oil wealth better than basically any other resource-rich country, the book's author, former McKinsey director Martin Beck-Holter, argues that both the public and private sector have essentially become too reliant on this oil money.
Oh, okay. That makes a little more sense to me, because Norway being good with money and investing smartly and being wealthy, that all seems like really good things. Like, every country is trying to do that. And Norway shouldn't be, like, punished, or Norway should not be ashamed to be successful. I don't think, yeah. But this is really arguing that Norway is too reliant on the money from oil and the wealth that oil has generated. Okay.
Giving way to a decade of stagnation. So, in this video, we're going to look at the book's basic argument, some of the objections, and try our best to figure out whether Norway has actually become too rich.
Interesting. This video is by TLDR News, by the way.
So let's get straight into it. Holter splits Norway's economic history into 5 chapters. The first chapter runs from 1905 until 1918, when Norway experienced an industrial boom, helped by massive foreign investment. According to historical data, Norway's industrial production grew by over 6% a year between 1905 and 1918.
In the 1900s, I mean the early 1900s, 1905, Norway received foreign investment?
Production grew by over 6% investment, when Norway experienced an industrial boom, helped by massive foreign investment.
Foreign investment? What does that mean? Who was investing in Norway in 1905? I don't think I know about this.
According to historical data, Norway's industrial production grew by over 6% a year between 1905 and 1918. And Norway went from being the 16th richest country in the OECD to the 10th in terms of GDP per capita. The second chapter runs from 1918 until 1973. During this time, Holter claims that the Norwegian state became too overbearing, deterring further foreign investment and stunting entrepreneurship. This was in part a legacy of the First and Second World Wars.
I don't know. This is a lot of criticism for a country that's done very, very well. and made a lot of smart decisions. This is very critical, but it is good to like make sure to think about these things and be self-critical, I guess.
which required the government to play an unprecedented role in planning the war economies. But it was also because Norway suffered two acute economic crises in the early 20th century. First, in the mid-20s, when the Norwegian central bank hiked interest rates in a misguided attempt to restore the krone to its pre-World War I rate.
Oh, this is a little bit of a history lesson about Norway. Really, the financial history of Norway, which I don't know much about. I've never heard of like a banking crisis in 1920 in Norway. I had no idea.
And then the Great Depression in the late 20s.
The Great Depression I have heard about.
These crises were widely perceived as crises of capitalism and dented Norway's faith in free markets. Norway thus maintained high taxes and strict price controls for most of the 20th century and adopted an unorthodox policy of super low interest rates, which gave way to chronic inflation. By 1973, just before the first oil crisis struck, Norway had the fourth lowest GDP per capita in the OECD, ahead of just Turkey, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal.
Wow. You know, I'm not a financial expert or anything. I can't really say if Norway made the smart decisions or bad decisions. In a general sense, you can. You can be like, oh, that was a good idea or that wasn't. Especially looking back in history. And it looks like whatever Norway was doing in 1970 was really bad. And it fell from like the 10th richest country down to like the 20th.
The third chapter runs from 1973 until 1991. During this time, two things happened. First, Norway's oil boom really kicked off.
Okay.
The oil sector went from nothing in 1975 to accounting for over 15% of GDP and 20% of tax revenues a decade later.
Wow, not that long ago, 1975 is when Norway really started becoming more reliant on the oil for money.
These revenues were incredibly well managed by Norway's sovereign wealth fund,
Yeah.
which invested heavily in foreign assets.
Yeah.
Not only did the return of these investments create a new source of revenue going forward, buying foreign assets also pushed down the value of the Norwegian krone, allowing Norway's other export-oriented industries to stay competitive.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard about this stuff, about the oil fund, the sovereign wealth fund that Norway has invested in companies all over the world, and Norway has done incredibly well with this fund. That's like one of Norway's biggest accomplishments ever, in my opinion.
The second thing that happened is that, like many other Western countries at the time, Norway moved right on economic issues.
Okay.
This process began in the 80s and 90s, when the Norwegian state privatised certain industries, improved the independence of the central bank, introduced a new competitive authority, liberalised its trading rules, and reformed its tax and banking systems.
Wow.
During this time, the oil boom pushed Norway up the OECD rankings, but Norway's non-oil economy didn't actually improve all that much. The fourth chapter runs...
Norway... You know what I didn't know? That Norwegians are probably a lot more familiar with? That you guys have had a really up and down history, financially. This chart is crazy.
From 1990 until 2013. According to Beck-Holter, this is when these pro-market reforms we just mentioned start paying dividends.
Okay.
Obviously, Norway's oil economy was booming, but the key point Beck-Holter wants to make here is that actually Norway's non-oil economy also performed incredibly well in this period.
Really?
Even if you exclude the oil economy, in 2013, Norway still had the third highest GDP per capita in the OECD, behind only Luxembourg and Switzerland.
So, you could argue Norway could do perfectly well even without the oil. Because I think a lot of people just say, oh, Norway is so lucky. It has all this oil. Well, yeah, that's lucky, but it's not luck that Norway invested all the money in a very smart way. And Norway has other industries like you guys like sell a lot of like fish and lumber or minerals and a lot of other stuff besides oil that apparently Norway would be like pretty good even without oil by the look of it.
Norway even had a higher GDP per capita than the US, despite the fact that Norwegians worked about 20% fewer hours. The fifth chapter, however, runs
What?
from 2013 and
Wait, what? What?
even had a higher GDP per capita than the US.
Norway did better than America, and you guys don't work as much. that's that's embarrassing for the United States, but that's great for Norway.
Despite the fact that Norwegians worked about 20% fewer hours. The fifth chapter, however, runs from 2013 until today.
Okay.
According to Beckholter, 2013 was essentially the peak, and Norway has been going downhill since.
Okay, now we're getting into very modern history. This is very recent. He's arguing Norway has peaked in 2013, over 10 years ago. And ever since, now, Norway is declining? Like, this sounds like it's very relative. If Norway was at this super high peak and then went down a little bit, it's still not that bad.
Outside the oil economy, productivity has stagnated. Real wage growth fell to just 0.2% a year, compared to 3% a year between 1990 and 2013.
Okay.
Weak exports, a lack of foreign investment, and persistent inflation have pushed down the krona by an astonishing 50% since 2013.
Whoa. Okay. That is significant. That is very significant. The Norwegian kroner losing 50% of its value versus the US dollar in the last 10 years. That's actually really bad.
And countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Iceland have essentially caught up in terms of GDP per capita. Beckholter essentially blames this stagnation on an overdependence on Norway's oil wealth. He claims, for instance, that Norwegian households take out unsustainable amounts of debt because they know the oil fund can always bail them out at the end of the day.
Oh, wow. This is a very interesting problem. Some people call this like the golden handcuffs, or like you have something so great, the oil that Norway will be able to sell for lots of money for the foreseeable future, but that has made Norway or Norwegians maybe a little complacent or a little over reliant on that. Although it sounds like the oil money will be there as a backup. It is true, but it's not good to like rest on your laurels, as we say. It's not good to just like assume that it'll always be great and like take out loans that are too big or something like that.
Which is why their debt-to-income ratio stands at 220%, the highest in the OECD.
Wow.
Similarly, he claims that the public sector has become more and more reliant on oil revenues, as evidenced by the fact that disbursements from the Sovereign Wealth Fund now account for 20% of government spending, up from about 4% in the 2000s.
What does this mean? What are disbursements from the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Does the Norwegian government pay like businesses with money from the fund, or I'm a little confused about this.
Beckholter claims that voters have become resistant to any sort of public sector reform because they think Norway can just spend its way out of trouble using its oil wealth. This explains why public spending has risen from about 50% of GDP in 2013 to more like 60% today.
So basically, because of the oil ever since the 70s, Norway has increased its spending because Norway got a lot more money, a lot more rich. And is that a problem, though? Because Norway is rich. It's a fact. So you're spending to match that new high level of income. Is it just too much?
But this hasn't led to better outcomes. For instance, in the 2010s, the number of health personnel increased in Norway but decreased in Denmark. But Danish health outcomes improved far more than Norwegian ones. Similarly, while Norway spends about 50% more on education than the OECD average,
Wow.
Norwegian schoolchildren actually underperform the OECD average on PISA tests. Finally, Beck-Holter claims too much of this public money is spent on welfare or industrial subsidies, which
Okay.
discourage productive work and shield unprofitable companies from foreign competition.
I see. So basically, Norway is slowly becoming a victim of its own success. It's like with anybody. Anybody who gets very, very successful has a difficult time maintaining that or not relaxing in a way. Is that's kind of like an oversimplification, but it's saying Norwegians aren't being as motivated, not as productive. Companies that would have failed are getting bailed out by oil money. The Norwegian government is spending too much money on social services, welfare, subsidies, because it's dipping into this oil money. All this oil money is causing Norway to spend, maybe more so than is reasonable.
Beck-Holter complains that Norway has become complacent about the extent of these problems, because there's an
see.
assumption that there's always the Sovereign Wealth Fund to fall back on. Unsurprisingly, the book has triggered a fair bit of pushback. A number of Norwegian academics and officials have questioned the data Beck-Holter uses, especially his use of GDP statistics from the Madison Project instead of official Norwegian data.
Okay. And yeah, I think that's good to push back. I think this should just be a discussion. I don't know if this Landet som ble forrykt, I don't know if this book is accurate. I have no idea. And it is true, Norway will have a lot of oil, and Norway has the Wealth Fund, which has like over $1 trillion. So it sounds like Norway is correct in acting like it's rich, because it is rich. But with anything, you can take it too far.
Which shows a far less dramatic slowdown between the fourth and fifth chapter. Many on the left see Beck-Holter's book, which essentially calls for cuts to public spending and more pro-business regulations, as just another right-wing manifesto dressed up as apolitical research. Perhaps the most difficult objection for Beck-Holter is that his basic claim, that Norway's oil wealth is the root of its current economic problems, isn't easy to square with the fact that most developed countries are having similar problems, with stagnant productivity, falling educational attainment, and rising antipathy towards establishment politicians.
Okay, that's a good point. If other countries are having the exact same problem, but they don't have the oil fund, so this might not even just be a Norway problem. This might be like a problem everyone's having.
Nonetheless, the fact that the book has attracted so much interest inside Norway suggests it's tapped into a relatively widespread sentiment in the country, and that, even if Norwegians don't think of themselves as too rich, they're still not wholly satisfied with the direction the country's going in, and there's a sense that Norway's political class should be doing better with the money it's got. Everything we've discussed...
Interesting. And there's elections coming up soon. In Norway, right? Elections. So is there going to be any big changes coming to Norway? I don't know. I'm just American, I don't hear very much about what's going on in Norway. So, but this was a really good news recap, because I had no idea this was even a problem or a big topic of discussion in Norway. I had no idea. It's so regardless of what you think, I think it is good to talk about and consider if there's a problem or not. So this was really cool. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts, especially if you're Norwegian and you know more about this. That'd be really cool to hear about. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Norway and learning about Norwegian culture, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.